we're so lucky, and I am so grateful to have Lisa Fontes here today. And I'm going to explain who she is and what she does, even though I know most of you know who she is and what she does. And her book, Little But Mighty, it was an amazing reference point for me when I wrote my book, especially with her expertise on coercive control. So let's get to know her. Lisa Aronson Fontes, PhD, serves as an expert witness in legal cases related to intimate partner abuse or coercive control, trauma, and child abuse. She works on family and criminal cases, particularly where cultural issues are relevant. Attorneys praise her testimony as decisive and impactful. They cite her reports for their level of detail, clear writing, concision, and organization. Born and raised in New York City, Fontes has traveled the globe lecturing on topics ranging from the sexual abuse of children to intimate partner violence. Working in the field as a psychotherapist, researcher, and activist, Fontes discovered that many agencies fail to comprehensively address the needs of their immigrant and cultural minority clients. She has dedicated her career to filling this gap, helping the mental health, social service, criminal justice, and legal systems provide better services in communities of color, especially for victims of violence. She provides keynotes and workshops for medical and mental health professionals, attorneys, judges, police, social workers, and community members. That's pretty unbelievable. I just have to stop and say that. Fontes earned her PhD in counseling psychology from the University of Massachusetts Amherst, where her dissertation focused on services for Latino victims of child sexual abuse. She also has a master's in psychology from New York University, a master's from Columbia University Graduate School of Journalism, and a bachelor's from Cornell University in Romance Languages and Literature. Fluent in Spanish and Portuguese, Fontes frequently conducts evaluations and training in these languages, as well as English. That's pretty amazing, Lisa. I didn't know that you were so multilingual. And then Fontes is the author of the books Invisible Chains, Overcoming Coercive Control in Your Intimate Relationship, Interviewing Clients Across Cultures, and Child Abuse and Cultures. Her books have sold over 50,000 copies and have been translated into Spanish, Korean, Japanese, and 2 forms of Chinese. She's received the award for the advancement of cultural competence in child maltreatment from the American Professional Society on the Abuse of Children in 2004. Lisa, thank you so much. How much good have you done for the world? And we're so honored to have you here with us today. And I always ask this question before we dive into the actual topic. What inspired you to do the work that you do?
I think, first of all, thank you so much for having me, Dr. Nay or Nadine. I'm very happy to be here with everybody today. It's always fun to speak about my work when I'm not on the stand, although I do enjoy being on the stand as well, I have to say. Like everything in life, my interest in this field is multi-determined. I certainly, in the course of my life, have been through some things personally. I have witnessed a lot of other people since about 1989 professionally going through child abuse, sexual violence, intimate partner violence. And for the first maybe 20 years of my career, I concentrated more on child abuse and neglect. And in more recent years, about the last decade, have moved more into working on issues of coercive control, domestic violence. I'm proud to say that my book is the second one. Invisible Chains is the second book ever written on coercive control in the world, as far as I know. Evan Starks, of course, was the first, and his book is absolutely groundbreaking. His book on coercive control, which came out in 2007, and then a new edition in 2023. And I found his book to be fascinating and important and a very difficult read, even with a PhD. And I went to him and I said, Evan, somebody needs to write about this in a way that people can easily grasp. And he gave me his blessing. And of course, I've learned an awful lot in the years since. And so anyway, that's what I'm doing here, I guess.
Yeah. And so, your book 2015 was when it was published?
Yes.
Yeah, I mean that's a long time ago, right? And so yeah, you're definitely really on the ground floor of educating all of us about coercive control. And it's interesting that you went to him and said to him, this book is too hard to understand, because one of the things that I love about your book is it's so digestible. It's very easy to understand. And that's really important if we want to educate people. So
that was really my goal. And since that time, I haven't been writing many scholarly articles. I decided I'm done with writing scholarly articles in jargon that only, a few hundred people will read if I'm lucky. I'm going to start writing for the general public. And so I've been writing. I have a column in psychologytoday.com called Invisible Chains. And I also write very frequently for domesticshelters.org. And some of the articles are repeats, but many are not. And domesticshelters.org has a wonderful library of materials, many by me, but many by other people as well, that are very helpful for people who are in or have left a relationship that involves domestic violence and coercive control.
Yeah. I've seen your writing in domestic shelters, and I'm glad you mentioned that, and Psychology Today. I will look that up for sure. So let's just start right at the basic, like right at the beginning. What do you define? What's your definition of coercive control?
Sure. That's coercive control is a strategy that some people use to control their intimate partners. It consists of various tactics, including isolating, which is always a big red flag, and it can happen in many different ways, verbal abuse, sexual abuse, legal abuse, physical abuse, manipulation, intimidation, and undoubtedly some other things that are not coming to mind. Not all of those tactics are present in every case. Monitoring is common as well. And what we call micromanaging, which is controlling minute aspects of a person's life. So not all of those elements are present in every relationship that is a coercive control relationship, but more than one is.
Yeah.
And some people mix up. They think that emotional abuse or psychological abuse and coercive control are the same thing, but they're not. And most people who think that they're suffering emotional abuse or psychological abuse, I would suggest that most of them, or many of them, are actually suffering coercive control. And let me talk about some of the differences. So psychological abuse or emotional abuse, I'm going to say just psychological abuse, could be of just one type. So it's like constantly humiliating the other person, or gaslighting them, making them doubt their reality. And that's psychological abuse. It could be one terrible incident. It could be multiple terrible incidents. It might be all of one kind, one type of abuse. Coercive control is a pattern of abuse that has multiple prongs. So the various things that I talked about, there's more than one of them going on. And part of the power, part of the harm of coercive control is that it occurs over time. So if something happened once, maybe it wouldn't be such a big deal, but it happens again and again and again over the course of months, years, even decades. And the other thing that's really important is that the person who's being victimized usually feels trapped. And that is a key factor in what makes it so harmful.
Yeah.
Coercive control can occur in other kinds of situations, in workplaces, sometimes coaches with athletes, in cults. But most of where I focus is in intimate partnerships. Some people who are in coercive control relationships experience coercive control at an earlier time in a religious setting, let's say. And then it doesn't feel unfamiliar to them when they are involved in an intimate partnership which has coercive control.
Right. And I like that you differentiate that from psychological abuse, because I think that's a very important differentiation. And did you mention sexual coercion?
I think I mentioned sexual abuse, which includes both sexual coercion, which is certainly very harmful, but there are other kinds of sexual abuse, for instance, deliberately causing a partner pain during sex. that, or deliberately humiliating a partner during sex, making them feel trapped during sex. So it's not necessarily just coercion. I think one I did not mention, though, and really needs to be mentioned, is financial abuse.
Yes. Okay.
Which is so often present and can look at differently in different couples. So, it exists in couples where there's great wealth. It exists in couples where there's poverty and everything in between. In some cases, it's creating a financial dependency in the person who I'm going to call victim, although we can say victim survivor. When I say victim, I mean victim survivor. In some cases, it's taking all their money. So maybe the abuser doesn't work at all and simply takes the money from their partner.
Yeah. I was going to bring up the financial coercion because it's such a huge piece of the puzzle here, especially when we're talking about dependency. And in your book, you talk about a continuum of coercive control.
Right. I mean, so there's some people, in Evan Stark's book, he presented 3 long case histories. And these are, the cases that he presented are just horrific in terms of the level of physical violence and the level of entrapment. I think it's important to say that coercive control doesn't necessarily look like that. So there are families where one person is coercively controlling the other, or couples where one person is coercively controlling the other, and they're not entirely isolated from the world. There may be no physical violence, and that it can be very difficult to name when there's coercive control without physical violence. And in fact, numerous people have said to me, I just wish he'd hit me because then I'd have an excuse to leave. So sometimes it's kind of the problem that has no name. There are all these things that feel wrong and make a person feel trapped, but they don't necessarily know the name of it. So when they hear coercive control and they understand all the parts of it, it connects the dots between all these kinds of harm. In my book, I have a chapter where I invite people to do kind of an inventory of their relationship. And for a lot of people, they find that to be very eye-opening because maybe there were certain things that, yes, they knew were abusive. But there are all these other things that they just thought were kind of bad, just not the best. Like maybe the sex, they thought of the sex as being not good, but they didn't really examine it as sexual abuse. Or, they weren't really feeling great about the fact that their partner had them give their email and password and insisted on being on their bank account as soon as they moved in, which they'd only known each other a month. Just to give you some examples, that they didn't feel good about those, but they didn't necessarily label those as abusive. And so when you do this kind of self-inventory, then you get a sense of, wow, there was really a lot more than I thought of. And on a regular basis, people tell me that in the process of doing this kind of inventory, they suddenly realized that they had been in denial about a lot of things. In their effort to make the relationship last, in the effort to provide a father often for their children, they had been closing their eyes to a lot of what was going on.
Yeah, that's so important that, right, we're not just thinking about extremes, because the extremes are very obvious. But I remember even being in my relationship and it was riddled with coercive control and I had no language for it. And I didn't know what was happening. So I like that you give those microaggressions that over time really do feel like you do become trapped. And you talk about, you state, and I love this in chapter 4, because one of the reasons I wrote my book is there's so much stigma around the victim. She's got learned helplessness, she's codependent, she's a love addict, and we've been stigmatizing the victim survivor for so long. But you state in chapter 4, all women are vulnerable. And can you explain that?
Sure. And let me just say that I also know some men who are victimized by coercive control, yes, either at the hands of women or at the hands of other men. But certainly it's much more common that men are victimizing women. And we can definitely talk about that later if you want. But let me first address the question that you just raised. So why are we all vulnerable? Well, at certain points in our lives, we are more vulnerable. If we are recently divorced, if we are in some kind of transition, maybe leaving high school, maybe leaving college, maybe just moved to a new area, have changed jobs, have lost a job during the pandemic. I mean, there are all kinds of inflection points where the kids have gone off, have left the home. I mean, there are all different points developmentally where people are more vulnerable, feeling a little bit lonely and bored in a marriage even. And if you have the bad luck of encountering somebody who is coercively controlling, you could be victimized. The fault, the personality characteristics are in the abuser. They're not in the victim. People can have, many good and some, people can have a whole range of relationships in their lives and not have a single one that looks like this. And one day they meet the wrong person and are taken in. These coercively controlling abusers are often, not always, but often very slick, very charming, very convincing. They have different tactics. Different ones have different tactics, and they adapt their tactics for the person, to their victim. So, they may be the big man around town with one person and be a gentle, sort of passive person with another, depending on what they see as the best way to get their claws into their next victim.
Yeah, I mean, isn't that the truth? And it's funny because before I asked you that question, my next question was, can you explain how coercive control shows up in different gendered arrangements?
Okay. Sure.
So
right.
That is important.
Yeah. And I'll just say, I myself was a victim of coercive control in a 4-year relationship after coming out of a pretty good 26-year marriage. And I was in this transition point and fell into this relationship. And even though I'd worked in domestic violence for a long time, I didn't recognize it, and was just so, when I found Evan Stark's work, it really made all the light bulbs go off for me. So that was incredibly helpful. And I believe that experience has given me a lot of insight into the experience of other people whose experiences are different from mine. I mean, by now I've talked to hundreds of survivors, and I know that my experience is just my experience, and everybody else's experience is theirs and is different. So the gender issues, there's not a lot of research on men who are caught in coercive control relationships, but there is some. And when men are victimized by women, usually they either have some special vulnerability. So they might be disabled, they might be undocumented. The female partner who is coercively controlling them may have more money than they have, but not always. Sometimes there are other ways that the coercively controlling woman can get and trap a male victim. Typically, men have an easier time leaving. So typically they don't live in fear, in physical fear. Right. And a lot of women who are being coercively controlled, even if they're not being assaulted physically, live in physical fear. So they're being intimidated. And that is, of course, frightening. Also, men are much more likely to perpetrate sexual abuse against their female partners than vice versa. And the sexually abusive part of coercive control relationships and domestic violence relationships, I think we don't give enough weight to, because people are not comfortable talking about sex. People who work in domestic violence are often not trained to talk about sex. People who work in sexual violence are often mostly trained to talk about sexual violence with strangers or dates, but not intimate partners. And so intimate partner sexual violence is something that kind of falls through the cracks, in my opinion. And I teach courses on sexual violence at Smith College and at University of Massachusetts Amherst, including units on sexual violence. So men have when men are in a relationship with a woman, they have all of, if you'll forgive me for using this word, which people in the US sometimes shy away from, they have all of patriarchy supporting their coercive control.
Oh, no, we like that word here. We like it. It's okay.
Okay. They're apt to have possibly a religious community, possibly a family. certainly the media, which understands them dominating the woman who they are involved with. And it's not hard for them to find supports for that. I also have worked with same-sex couples, and where one person is coercively controlling the other. And that it can be really hard for people in same-sex couples to recognize what's happening, because especially if you have two women, when they think of domestic abuse, they think of a man. And so they may be controlled, manipulated, abused in certain ways within their relationship and not really understand that that's what's happening because there's no man in the room.
Right. I mean, it's just such a complex subject. Just, when you're talking about it from all these different angles. And you also write about why some men do, aside from patriarchy, control their partners this way.
Well, it's to their advantage to do so from their perspective. It's about resources. And this is one thing that I think Evan Stark, drives home all the time. That we focus a little too much on psychology and we don't focus enough on resources. People coercively control their partners because they want that person's money, they want that person's childcare services, they want maybe children by that person, they want sex from that person, they can dominate the friend group, they can control the TV remote. There's just a lot of goodies that a coercively controlling person can get and may not understand other ways of getting.
Yeah. They get their cozy comforts, as I say. And that makes sense. Not to me, but I understand from that perspective, if that's what you're thinking about and you're very into your own need fulfillment, then you're going to figure out different ways to get those needs met, even if it's at the expense of someone that you supposedly love. And
can I focus on what you just said about supposedly love?
Yes.
I did an article called Romance Fraud on romance fraud. And if you Google that term, romance fraud, most of what you'll come up with is stuff about online exploitation. But I did a piece on how romance fraud can occur face-to-face as well. And so I think there is a portion of coercive control relationships, certainly not all of them, but there's a portion where the abuser is becoming involved and staying involved with someone to get access to something they want, their money, their house, a lifetime of child support, whatever it is. They want something. And they're duping the victim. Yeah. And they're good at it. So there's no shame if one has been victimized in this way. There's no shame in it, because if they weren't good at it, they wouldn't be able to have done it to you, and they wouldn't be able to have done it to whoever else they've done it to or are going to do it to. But it's so disturbing and disconcerting when people discover that, in fact, what they thought was love, someone they may have married, had children with, moved across the country to be with, supported through medical school or whatever, when they discover that, in fact, the romance was actually a fraud.
Yeah, and I'm so glad. I love that term, romance fraud. I haven't heard it before, but we talk often in here how, in the trauma bond with the intermittent reinforcement, what happens is you fall in love with Romeo, and then the mask falls and in comes Dirty John. And just how incredibly confusing that is. But if somebody has the intention to manipulate you and you don't know that, and they're presenting this Romeo mask, it's not your fault.
Right. One of the ways I love that Romeo becomes Dirty John. One of the ways I talk about it is that initially the coercively controlling abuser is like a warm sun most of the time. They shower their future victim with love. They brighten them up with warmth. And the person feels so good. They feel so seen and appreciated like never before. And so they're willing to make certain sacrifices. I'll stop seeing my friends. I'll spend all my time with you. You can get on my bank account, whatever, because it all feels so good. But over time, and sometimes it's a long time, and sometimes it's a really short time, that sun shrinks. So it's like a spotlight. And then the victimized person is always trying to run around and get in the spotlight again. How can they capture that good feeling that they had in the beginning? What am I doing wrong that I don't have that good feeling again? What can I do now that will make you back into that person you were in the beginning? And so it becomes exhausting, right? It's absolutely exhausting to try to please someone who's not going to be pleased no matter what you do, and everything will be blamed on you.
Yeah, it's mission impossible, as they say. And Karen A has a question. Can you please give an example of how we can see and know if they really are staying with us for a reason to get something, especially in a long-term marriage?
Boy, that is hard, isn't it?
Yeah.
I mean, some of the ways you can see somebody's who they are is try to set some boundaries for yourself. So, you know, what happens if you decide that you want to go away with your sister or your brother or your mother or a girlfriend, or just even spend time by yourself? What happens if one of the goodies that you're giving, like agreeing to sex at times when you don't want to, let's say, which is a very common thing for women to do, or you know, sharing your salary in certain ways, doing certain household chores. I mean, I'm sure you can think of many other things.
Yeah.
What happens if you take some of that back and you say, you know what, every day for sex is too often for me. You know, I'd like to switch to maybe once a week, or, you know, when I feel like it. And how do they handle you're retracting some of the benefits that you're giving? I almost think that if you're having this question, then there's a reason you're having the question.
Right.
And so, you know, of course, therapy is always good. I think that this group is probably a good group for exploring those questions.
Yeah. Those are great.
What, you know, if you're giving money and you're not comfortable with that anymore, what happens if you say, you know what, I think it's time that you got a job, or I think it's time that you contributed to the rent, or how about if you pay for this vacation? Like what happens?
Yeah, that's great. That's so great. I always say, if you want to know you with the narcissist, set a boundary, but that's even better if you're in this relationship, starting to take away the perks or what you're
explore what happens. I mean, one of the things that I think might be helpful is, you know, people say, well, how do you know the difference between somebody who's coercively controlling and somebody who's just kind of picky? Like, you know, the same person, you know, a partner could say, I want my towels folded like this, and I want the cabinets arranged like that. Okay. And I want, you know, if there's a car, I want you to park the car like this. Are they being picky, or are they being coercively controlling? The question is, what happens if you don't do it? Are you afraid? Is there going to be, are you afraid you're going to be punished in some way? There's going to be a really negative outcome, rather than just, you know, hey, I didn't feel like it today, or I thought I'd try something different. If there's that feeling of dread that it's going to create something terribly negative, then it's worth looking at.
Yeah. Yep. That makes sense. That how you feel if you have autonomy, like what happens inside of you if you have autonomy. Do you fear that person, or you're like, oh well, they'll get over it? Yeah, that's a great way to have discernment. And you know, we always talk about, and the research shows that when somebody wants to leave this relationship, it can be a very dangerous time.
Absolutely. So the most dangerous time in a domestic violence relationship is when a person decides to leave. And especially if they announce it, and after the 18 months after the breakup are the most dangerous time. I always encourage people to do safety planning with their local domestic violence agency, which you can find by going to domesticshelters.org, and you put in your zip code, and they'll give you your local domestic violence agency, and they'll really help you figure out, even if you're not planning on leaving, but even if you're planning on staying, ways that you can stay safe within the relationship. It doesn't mean you have to go to a shelter or anything like that. They're just going to help you figure out some of the things you need financially, for your physical safety, in terms of emotional support. If you have children or pets you're concerned about, they're going to help you figure all that out.
Yeah.
So that period of separation is very dangerous. If there's kids involved, many abusers will threaten to take the kids, and are finding ways to do that are absolutely frightening. And that's where sometimes I step in, and other experts can step in and explain to the courts what's happening. Increasingly these days, we see domestic abusers using DARVO, which I assume you've talked about here. So deny, attack, reverse, victim, and offender. DARVO, deny, attack, reverse, victim, and offender, where a domestic abuser will try to make everyone believe that, in fact, the victim is the abuser, and often will succeed in making the victim think that maybe they're abusive. They'll tell the victim, you're narcissistic. You have a problem. If only you did X, Y, or Z, then this wouldn't happen. And so you'll often see people who are being victimized trying to fix themselves, thinking, what's wrong with me that I don't want to have sex all the time? Or what's wrong with me that I seem to keep doing things which bother my partner?
Yeah. Yeah. Okay. So 18 months. That's good. I didn't know that time frame, that it's actually that exact time frame. I mean, I'm sure it can be flexible, but that's very important to know. And so you're saying the best way to end is to really go to a domestic violence advocate, get a safety plan, even if you're not thinking you're going to leave that moment, but just going and talking to someone. So getting yourself educated to stay
Yes.
safe.
And even if there's been no physical violence, unfortunately, in 20% of domestic violence homicides, there was no domestic violence between the couple. And I'm not even talking about domestic violence reports to the police. No domestic violence as far as we know, but there was coercive control. So there are a certain number of coercively controlling abusers who don't use physical violence. They don't need to in the relationship. They're able to control their partner in other ways. But when that partner asserts an intention to leave, then they can become, lethally violent. They can commit a homicide. Now, people usually have a pretty good instinct about whether they're at risk for that or not. Not everybody is. Not the vast majority of abusers would not kill their partner. But if that's but it's not just about that. If you do safety planning, you're also trying to figure out what's the best way for me to handle this with the kids. What's the best way for me to handle this in terms of money? At what point do I talk to a lawyer?
Right.
If I can afford a lawyer. What are some of the documents I want to make sure I bring with me? What are some of the things in the day-to-day that I want to make sure we're documenting? Some domestic abusers in the few months are planning to leave the relationship themselves. They're planning on calling it quits. Maybe they have a new, honey on the side. Maybe they want to just try something new. And in those months in preparation for leaving, will have a deliberate strategy of how to maximally hurt their partner. So that can include suddenly appearing as super dad. So someone who's not been interested in going to the doctor's appointments suddenly wants to go to all the doctor's appointments. Maybe they even want you to stay home so they can bring the child alone. Suddenly they're going to all the parent-teacher conferences. And they may be also videotaping interactions, creating interactions, and then videotaping them. Or there may be, cameras in the house, so-called nanny cams, or outside the house, where they're recording and then intend to use just really discrete chunks of that, 10 seconds, a couple of 10-second moments to make the case that their victim is actually the abuser. So it's very important to it's very important to assume that there could be recording devices, and to be very careful with what one says if you're living in that kind of situation.
Yeah, I'm so glad you brought that up. Christine did a post about that yesterday, and it's so common within this community. We talk about it, how when you're in this sort of dynamic and you might appease, you might please, you might placate, you might shrink, you might do everything, and then sooner or later you're going to explode, and how then they rip out the camera. And I'm curious, in the work that you do you see that when you're in the courtroom?
So, what Christine Cotriolo posted about yesterday was a piece that I wrote called Provoke and Record. And if
Yes.
you Google that term, provoke and record, it'll pop up. I see this all the time, not just in the courtroom, but I see those little snippets of tape being given to guardians ad litem or to child protective services investigators by abusers who will say, you know, my wife is crazy, my girlfriend's crazy. Look at the footage here. And that can make them look really bad. Now, if you are, you know, if a lamb lives in a wolf's den for long enough, the lamb will eventually try to kick back and bite back, right?
Yeah.
If they survive. And so I completely understand that. But if there is footage, some kind of recording of a person, a victimized person acting out, cursing, you know, saying I could kill you, you know, throwing things or whatever, it's not great for court.
Right.
You know, it just makes it harder. So if somebody has done those things, you know, don't feel bad about it. Everybody does what they feel like they need to at the time, but try to resist being provoked in that way, because it will be used against you.
Right. Right. And so, you know, you wrote your book in 2015. And so now you've been doing all of your work and writing and teaching and, you know, being an expert witness in court. What has changed about coercive control in the modern day era that you see today?
Yeah, what a great question. Thank you for that. So when I wrote my book in 2015, the term coercive control was virtually unknown in the United States. I mean, Evan Stark had written his groundbreaking scholarly book in 2007, which was huge in the United Kingdom, and they had laws on coercive control which started in 2016. So Europe was way ahead of us, but there were no laws on coercive control in the US, and people in domestic violence were just beginning to become aware of it. Now there are 7 states which have laws on coercive control in the books, and quite a few other legislatures are considering having them. In the U.S., it's all in family code except for Hawaii, where it's a petty misdemeanor. But there is some overlap between family code and criminal code, because if there's a protective order against someone, let's say in my home state of Massachusetts, if there's a protective order against someone and that person coercively controls their partner or ex-partner, they can be arrested for breaking the protective order. So it does have criminal implications. There's we being those of us in the field like you, Nadine, and other people here perhaps, you know, are working hard to educate both the general public, the police, attorneys, judges, and therapists about coercive control. I'm going to speak next week at the Massachusetts Bar Association conference in Northampton, which I'm very excited about, on coercive control. So trying to help people understand what it is. You get a lot of misconceptions. You know, I hear people saying it's subtle abuse. Well, it's not subtle. I mean, there's really nothing subtle about, you know, somebody taking away your freedom. You know, there's nothing subtle about somebody stealing money from you, as often happens. So it's not that it's subtle, but it's that it may not be visible to outsiders. I think that's why, you know, my book is called Invisible Chains, because it's certainly very visible to the victimized person, but it may not be visible to others.
Yeah.
So what else has changed in coercive control? I mean, I think we have a much better understanding. I think there's an understanding that post-separation abuse is coercive control in the post-separation period. And so that's one of the things that I testify about quite a bit. A lot of times you have judges who are like, well, who cares? They don't live together anymore. I don't care that there was domestic violence in this relationship when they were together. So it's really helping judges understand that what's happening now that the couple is separated, the litigation abuse, the financial abuse, the trying to control the other partner and access the other parent through the kids, that all of that is coercive control, maybe even monitoring post-separation. All of that is coercive control in the post-separation period. Some terms have come to the fore, like Darvo, like Provoke and Record. David Adams from Emerge in Boston, which is the first matter intervention program in the US, which he founded. He came up with the term, and we wrote a piece on it together called spiteful disregard. Spiteful disregard. And that is where an abuser would rather get back at their ex than treat the kids right post-separation. So they will disregard the child, their child's needs, to get back at their ex. For instance, not feeding the children adequately when they're in their house. Or, in one case, like shaving a girl's head, which was so humiliating and embarrassing for her. But the abuser was happy to do that because he knew how much it would upset his the child's mother. So, there are a lot of terms that have been invented, which I think are helpful. I mean, terms are helpful because they help us name things that when they don't have a name, it's harder to think about.
Oh, yeah. So I've never heard of spiteful disregard either. So that's really, really important. And it shows the pathology of a person that would do that. And so you kind of answered my question, because I want to give the ladies time to ask questions too. But that's the work that you do today, is educating judges and lawyers and other therapists, as well as teaching at school, and then you go to court for people.
Correct.
Yeah, right. What a gift. What a gift you are, Lisa.
I actually do, thank you. I don't work as a therapist. I don't do that anymore.
Yeah. Well, you're busy doing a lot of other things. Okay, guys. Well, we are going to let Lisa go because she's given us an hour of her time. And Lisa, I just want to thank you so much for coming on. I mean, your information is priceless. Your experience is just unbelievable and phenomenal. And what you've done with your life and this work is very special.
Well, thank you so much, Nadine. This was actually fun. And, I'm sorry about the experiences people have gone through and are going through. And I really, I like the fact that we're all educating ourselves and getting out there and trying to make a difference in the world. Sometimes people have to go through their own journey first, and that makes all the sense in the world. But eventually, I do believe change will happen. So thank you.
Yes. Thank you, Lisa. Everybody have a beautiful afternoon. Take care.
Take care.
And everybody's saying